Wilkins, Dean of the School of Public Affairs at American University, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to tonight's event. You'll have the pleasure of hearing a conversation between our Professor Alan Levine and General H.R. McMaster. I know you'll be excited to hear them share and talk about HR's book. The Political Theory Lecture Series at AU was started by Professor Levine 25 years ago and was originally funded out of his own pocket. I had to question him about that as a dean and figure out exactly what this was when faculty were funding their own opportunities. But I was quite impressed to learn that this is an undertaking he started 25 years ago, probably not thinking it would last more than a couple of years, but has continued to bring these great events to our community time and time again across the years. The first speaker was Stephen Macedo of Princeton University, and he'll be back to mark this anniversary of 25 years next week in another conversation. The Political Theory Lecture Series has gone through various manifestations. For many years, it was called the Washington, D.C. Political Theory Colloquium, after Levine had representatives of all the D.C. area universities meet in his living room to organize citywide series of events. Then Tom Merrill arrived at AU and the partnership grew into the Political Theory Institute, which has been educating and provoking students for the past 10 years. From its humble roots, PTI and its precursors have succeeded in raising almost $1 million from private foundations, brought in over 200 scholars to AU from around the world, sponsored debates featuring prominent voices such as General Michael Hayden, Camilla Paglio, Charles Murray, and Cornel West, and hosted a series of postdoctoral fellows and visiting fellows from France, and runs an essay competition every May for the best AU undergraduate essay on classic liberalism. Somebody doesn't have mute on.
No, not really.
Mute their phone.
Jack Holdsworth. Jack Holdsworth, mute.
Okay. So PTI has an audience that is not only AU students, faculty, and staff, but others from around the DC community, from think tanks, from Congress, from the media, often join in our events and enjoy the conversations that they hear. I want to say a little bit more about PTI in that I think it holds a special place on the university. It's often a place where people go to have big questions and talk about not only what it means to be a good scholar or a good student, but good human beings and good citizens in our troubling time. It presents a wide variety of views, both from across today's political spectrum, and just recently we've seen talks on Plato, Dante, Adam Smith, Dubois, show a great interest in thinkers throughout the ages. I am proud to say that PTI is an important part of the School of Public Affairs. It's done great work and will continue to do so, raising the visibility of the university, the school, the department, and enriching the lives of our students. I again want to thank Alan for his tremendous leadership and welcome HR to tonight's event. Please enjoy.
Thank you very much, Dean Wilkins. I really appreciate that. I just want to echo a few things that Dean Wilkins said. First, she mentioned students, undergraduates out there. We run an essay contest every May. Best essay on classical liberalism. Go to our website, check it out. It's got a $500 cash prize. I'd also like to give some shout outs to my theory colleagues without whom PTI wouldn't be nearly what it is. Not only Tom Merrill, who Dean Wilkins mentioned, but Borden Flanagan, Sarah Hauser, Jeremy Janow, Chris Utter, Brad Jackson, Gabe Whipred, and a shout out to our communications team, Jay Rao, Lisa Manning, Mackenzie Oldham, Chanel Ashman, and everyone else for making all these events possible. I want to just say a quick word about our future events this semester. So on February 18th, as Dean Wilkins mentioned, we have Stephen Macedo of Princeton University talking on After the Backlash, Immigration, Populism, and Liberal Nationalism. On March 8th, we have a panel discussion of the life and work of Gertrude Himmelfarb, who's a moral historian, a towering figure of the late 20th and early 21st century. And the panelists on that will include William Crystal, Matt Continenti, Jerry Moeller, and Samuel Moyne. And on April 1st, we have one of Europe's leading philosophers, Remy Bragg, talking about what went wrong with modernity. So we hope that you'll come back and join us for some of those events. Our speaker today is H.R. McMaster, U.S. Army retired, currently a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. And it might seem odd that the Political Theory Institute would have a general joining us. He is not the first general we've had. As Dean Wilkins mentioned, we've had General Michael Hayden. But I think that you'll see that his work and his life touch on several big theoretical questions that we hope to get into tonight. He's also chairman of the board of advisors at the Center on Military and Political Power at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. And General McMaster was the 26th assistant to the president for national security affairs. He served as a commissioned officer in the United States Army for 34 years before retiring in June of 2018. From 2014 to 2017, he helped design the future Army as the director of Army Capabilities Integration Center and the deputy commanding general of the Army Training and Doctrine Command. And as commanding general of Fort Benning, he oversaw all training and education for the Army's infantry, armor, and cavalry forces. He has extensive wartime experience in both Gulf Wars and Afghanistan, and also served as advisor to the most senior military commanders in the Middle East, Iraq, and Afghanistan. But he's not only a warrior. McMaster holds a PhD in military history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and he taught at the United States Military Academy from 1994 to 96. He's the author of the award-winning book, Dereliction of Duty, Lyndon Johnson, Robert McNamara, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the Lies That Led to Vietnam. And most recently, of this handsome volume, Battlegrounds, The Fight to Defend the Free World. He was a contributing editor for Survival, Global Politics and Strategy from 2010 to 2017, and has published scores of essays, articles, and book reviews in The Atlantic, Foreign Affairs, Survival, the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times. And of course, he is with us at American University all spring semester as a Sine Fellow. So, HR, welcome to American University. We're really pleased to have you here.
Hey, thanks, Alan. It's great to be with you, and Dean Wilkins. Thank you for the opportunity, and I'm really thrilled to be on campus. I mean, albeit virtually, as a Sine Fellow, and thanks to all of you who are attending today.
Okay, great. So I tried to build up your theory creds, and I want to come to that eventually. But I'd like to begin maybe with a little bit of political gossip, since you are positioned, and you may know that American University students are consistently rated the most political or among the most political of all students in the entire nation. So our students live and breathe politics, and you've had some inside access. I'd like to sort of hear what you have to say. We just transitioned to a new administration. What do you know about the people in the Biden administration doing foreign policy? Do you know them? What do you think of them?
Thanks. Hey, well, Alan, I know many of them, and they're quite experienced, and they I think understand well the challenges and opportunities that we're facing, and the work that we have to do together, as Americans, but then with like-minded partners to build a better future for generations to come. So, my philosophy is, they deserve our support, because, really, I do think the partisan politics that we've seen, this destructive partisan politics, should really stop at the water's edge, right? I think it's important to realize that, whether you're Republican or Democrat, you shouldn't want the Chinese Communist Party to be able to export its authoritarian mercantilist model, right? If they succeed in doing so, the world and our nation will be less free, less prosperous, and less safe. Who's for Vladimir Putin, pitting us against each other and diminishing our confidence in our democratic principles and institutions and processes, even though politicians across the spectrum have compromised, I think, our principles, and especially President Trump, since the presidential election of last year. We can all agree that that's bad, right? Who wants North Korea with a nuclear weapon? And hey, Alan, I mean, let's think back to 9/11. the most devastating terrorist attack in history, Al Qaeda didn't target Republicans or Democrats; they targeted Americans, right? So I think it's around these issues of foreign policy that we should come together and work together in a cooperative manner.
Okay, thanks. So we'll encourage all you students out there, give them a chance, the new team a chance. What
Yeah.
can you tell us about the new Secretary of Defense?
Well, he's a fine, principled person who's led soldiers with great distinction under the most difficult conditions of combat. What I can tell you about him is that he is truly a selfless servant. I've known him across many years. And Alan, I think so much of your potential to contribute in life depends on your base motivation. And what Lloyd Austin is motivated by is serving his country, and making the best contribution he can to our national security and to advance our interests. So I think what President Biden is going to get is somebody of extraordinary character who will give him his best military advice. And I think what the Department of Defense will get and what our armed forces will get is a principled leader of character who will do everything he can every day to give them the tools that they need to defend our nation. So, I'm very happy to see him confirmed, and I think he'll serve in that position with great distinction.
And what can you tell us about the new Secretary of State, Tony Blinken? Have you met him? What do you think of him?
Yeah. I have met him, but not, I don't know him well, right? I met him when a dear friend of mine was being installed as the ambassador to South Sudan. And and so I had a chance to talk with him really briefly there. But of course, I followed him over the years. And I think it's worth looking at his testimony. I think he did an excellent job, Alan, in his testimony. I think that you couldn't really detect any inkling of a partisan leaning. And of course, as you'd expect, he criticized aspects of the Trump administration policy, but he was very clear on China. And I think he highlighted some critical continuities in connection with the competition with the Chinese Communist Party, but also expectations of Iran. For if the Iranian regime thought he was just going to try to turn the clock back to 2016 and ignore their destructive behavior in the region, well, they were wrong about that. And he also made clear that if there is any kind of a new deal with Iran, it would have to also take into account some of those dangerous capabilities that lie outside the deal, especially missiles capability, and also to address the sunset clause, which is one of the flaws of the previous deal. So I'll tell you, I really thought his testimony was thoughtful, and was a really solid approach to foreign policy that Americans across both political parties should be able to get behind.
Okay, great. I just want to remind our viewers to stay muted and to submit any questions that you have live through the chat feature. HR and I will talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll take questions for about 45 minutes. And it is our custom to take questions from students first. So that would be undergraduates, recent alums, like that. And so just as last thing on the current Biden administration, how about any people in the White House? Linda Thomas Greenfield, Jake Sullivan, do you know them?
Yeah. I don't know them well, but I do know them by reputation and certainly by following their viewpoints over the years. Of course, I think the National Security Advisor job that Jake Sullivan has is immensely important, obviously, because as the team comes together in a new administration, it's typically that White House staff comes together more rapidly than the departments and agencies are able to get in their political appointees. So you have to really run a collaborative process with kind of a skeleton crew across the departments and agencies to tee up options for the president, so the president can determine what his foreign policy agenda is. And as you've noticed, probably foreign policy was not much discussed during the election and even the aftermath, right? And maybe for understandable reasons, as we go through these traumas of a pandemic, a recession, and social divisions associated with George Floyd's murder and the aftermath, and now this terrible vitriolic political season associated with the presidential election and the unfounded rumors of widespread corruption in the aftermath and the assault on the Capitol. Okay, well, but if you're not, to paraphrase the quotation, maybe falsely attributed to Trotsky, right? You may not be interested in foreign policy, but foreign policy is interested in you, right? And we know from the pandemic that problems that develop overseas and are not dealt with early can only be dealt with at an exorbitant price once they reach our shores. So I hope that the discussion does shift more to foreign policy. Jake Sullivan, I think, is in an immensely important role as the only person in the foreign policy establishment who has the president as his only client to tee up the key challenges, to give the president options, and then to assist with the sensible, you would hope, implementation of his policies and decisions.
Okay, let the record show that H.R. McMaster is quoting Trotsky. All right, so you served HR for over a year in the Trump administration. What can you, or what are you willing to tell us about President Trump as a man?
Well, I'm just going to lay down on this couch here, Alan, for a second, and use this as a therapy session. No, I'll tell you, I really am grateful for the opportunity to have served. Right? I mean, this was the 5th president I'd served in uniform. You know, I took the oath of service when I was 17 years old and entered West Point. You know, I took the kind of maybe extreme position of George Marshall and never voted. You know, across my 34-year career, as a way to personally do everything I could to keep that bold line in place between our military and partisan politics. And not that I expect that of anybody else, certainly nobody outside the military. I mean, I encourage everyone to exercise our you know, the privilege we have as citizens to vote. So this was serving, you know, another commander in chief. And the opportunity kind of came out of the blue, Alan. I saw it kind of as a bonus round, right, to help this new president. You know, what I had hoped to do is help him restore a degree of strategic competence and to put together, you know, strategies and approaches to our most significant challenges and our most significant opportunities, so we could overcome those challenges and take advantage of those opportunities. I think we did that in the 13 months I was there, despite, you know, a great deal of friction, you know, from across the government within the administration. And as you know, the noise level associated with this administration was very high. But I think we ran a competent process for him and for the country. And you know, I had an opportunity to work with extraordinarily dedicated civil servants and those who volunteered to serve their country. You know, you hear about all of the friction and the drama, you know, about the White House. But what you don't see,
right? Which was
well,
true.
I mean, elements of that are true, you know, but you know, I'll tell you, there are people who made it happen despite all of that, and these are those who worked on the National Security Council staff and across the departments and agencies, you know. And I know we'll probably talk more about this, you know, but I think delivered some very important results that will carry over across multiple administrations. And perhaps foremost among those, Alan, was the shift from, you know, a so-called approach to China of cooperation and engagement under the assumption that China, having been welcomed into the international order, would play by the rules, would liberalize its economy, and as it prospered, would liberalize its form of governance. Okay, it was clear that assumption no longer was true, it was demonstrably false by that point. And what we needed to do is to compete much more effectively. And I think with the China strategy that you saw declassified about 3 weeks ago, it didn't get much attention because of all the other, you know, all the other events that were occurring and traumas that were occurring. But it's a fundamentally sound approach, and what underpins that framework that was declassified is some really detailed and important work that I think the new administration will carry on. You know, and I think, you know, I argue in the book, you know, that we have to pay attention to the agency and influence and authorship over the future that others enjoy. And I think what we will see as an element of continuity in China policy is the continued aggression of Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah. I'm going to hold up your book again, right? The Battlegrounds. And it's really, I've read most of it. I'm going to say it's a serious book. It's over 400 pages with like 75 pages of footnotes, right? In addition to the 400 pages of text. And it's really, I would say, 3 kind of books in one. On the one hand, the kind of unifying thread is your experience in government and things that happened and how you went to deal with things. But the second aspect of it is a history lesson, and it's a deep dive into the history of the 6 main battlegrounds around the world: China, Russia, the Middle East, Afghanistan, etc., North Korea. And so it's a deep dive into the history. And then growing out of the history are policy recommendations, right, for the future based on reality. So I will say it's a very sobering book. Um, and, I shared most of your thoughts going in, but there was way more sobering information and details than I was aware of. And I can only believe, because it's all sourced to publicly available material, that you know a lot more sobering information about all of these countries. But I want to pursue a couple of lines of inquiry from the book. And you repeatedly speak, including in the book's subtitle, of free and open countries. And many cynics today, even in our own country, doubt that the US and the West generally are morally superior to other nations on earth. You hear constantly about our inequality, our racism, our imperialism. So my question to you is, based on both your knowledge and your experience, can you explain what you see as the difference between the free world and the not free world?
Yeah. Well, thanks, Alan. I really think even in this moment in which we still have, we still are coping with the traumas that I mentioned, I think we ought to take a moment to celebrate, Alan. And I'm not Pollyannish about the challenges we're facing and the strain that has been placed on our democratic institutions and processes. But heck, we do have a say in how we're governed, right? And while we lament the fact that this election was traumatic and we're divided, well, if we weren't divided, hey, that looks like one party rule to me, and that's the Chinese Communist Party. That doesn't look like a fun situation to be in. And I think we ought to also celebrate the fact that we have rule of law in our country. We had this test to our democratic process of an election, and it was adjudicated in insulated adjudicative bodies, that adhered to the rule of law, right? We do have freedom of speech and freedom of the press, and while much of that is vitriolic and hate filled and tends towards these fantastic conspiracy theories and divisive material that polarizes us and pits us against each other, the alternative is to not have free speech, right? And this again looks like a model such as that in China, right, where we just saw the 53 freedom activists and then 11 more arrested in Hong Kong, for example. Or if you have the temerity to suggest that maybe there ought to be a look into the origins of COVID-19, you wind up in jail for 18 years. So I think it's really important for us to recognize that we have something great here in terms of our democracy. But I think we should recognize, as our founders did, right, that our republic requires constant nurturing, right? And while there have always been flaws in the American experience, the most foremost among them, the institution of chattel slavery and how that was the most dramatic contradiction, right, to our founding documents. But we should celebrate that sadly almost 100 years later, we fought our most destructive war in history to emancipate 4 million of our fellow Americans. We can again be disappointed in the failure of Reconstruction. We can be disappointed in the rise of Jim Crow and the Ku Klux Klan and separate but equal, but we should extol the achievements of the civil rights movement and the end of de jure segregation and inequality of opportunity, but recognize that de facto segregation and inequality of opportunity is still with us. But hey, let's work on that together. There's a lot we need to do, in education and in strengthening our effective governance and institutions and equal treatment under the law and equal opportunity. So I'm an optimist about this, Alan. And for those who want to ascribe a degree of moral equivalency with authoritarian regimes, I say I think that's wrongheaded. I think that in our democracy, of course, we have the freedom to self-flagellate. I think we do that quite effectively. But we ought to take a moment to recognize how fortunate we are.
Yeah. Are there any particular episodes from when you've been around the world of where sort of seeing unfreedom up close and kind of being shocked by it?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I would say, Alan, that what I have seen as the most traumatic negative effect on people is the absence of rule of law, right? And confidence in equal treatment under the law. Because what happens is people need protection from somewhere, right? And so what happens is then they look for protections from a tribe, for example, and they identify with a tribe and a tribal leader who has a, a political agenda and often is engaged in a violent struggle for power and resources, for example. And when you have this kind of competition that is associated with a sub identity to a representative government, what you then have is you also have competitions to play out within state institutions and functions. And what happens is they become the prize in competitions. And often these organizations, oftentimes organized around an ethnic or a sectarian identity, then vie for power within those institutions and do so by corrupt means. These groups become stakeholders in state weakness because it's the weakness of state institutions and functions that gives them impunity and freedom of action. And so what you're doing is perpetuating state weakness and really putting a country on the course to state failure, right? And to perpetuate violence. So hey, I've seen it, Alan, and it's horrible. This is what creates the humanitarian catastrophes we've seen and perpetuates them across the greater Middle East, for example. And I write about this extensively in the chapters on the Middle East that view through the frame of this very destructive sectarian civil war across the region.
Yeah, I always recommend my students to travel as much as they can as a way of liberating their mind, reading great old books from different points of view and traveling. And I have lots of students who have been down on America in one way or another until they go someplace else and they see how it is there and they come back like, wow, I can't believe how good we have it.
Well, this is the arc that the people like Christopher Hitchens had in his life. Remember how he romanticized communist totalitarian government until he actually got a whiff of it and became one of the greatest advocates for liberal democratic governance.
Yeah. Okay, good. I want to ask about something else in the book, and your analysis is framed throughout in the sort of opposition of strategic narcissism and strategic empathy. And strategic narcissism is your phrase, or you borrow from Hans Morgenthau, I think, for the problem that we suffer, and strategic empathy is the solution. Can you tell us what you mean by those two ideas?
So strategic narcissism is the tendency to define the world only in relation to us, right? And this is a problem because it's self-referential and it doesn't acknowledge the agency, the influence, the authorship over the future that the other has. And the strategic narcissism also often leads to wishful thinking and self-delusion. This is a lodestone around our necks and a reason for the diminishment, I think, of much of our strategic competence, especially in the post-Cold War period. And I think that strategic narcissism is evident in the optimism of the 1990s, optimism that grew over victory over the Soviet Union in the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, the lopsided military victory over the fourth largest army in the world in the 1991 Gulf War. And this led to, I think, belief in a number of assumptions that underpinned our foreign policy or provided kind of the optimistic view that drove foreign policy. And that is that the arc of history had guaranteed the primacy of our free and open societies over closed authoritarian systems. Ideological competition was over. Also related to that is that great power competition was a relic of the past, and that our tremendous technological military prowess that would guarantee our safety well into the future. That if any nation even had the temerity to challenge us, a future war would be fast, cheap, efficient, low cost, waged from standoff range and so forth. And this was a setup, Alan, for, I think, strategic shocks and disappointments of the 2000s involving the mass murder attacks of 9/11, the unanticipated length and difficulty of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the financial crisis. And it was after that this emotional impetus shifted to pessimism and resignation, and a belief that instead of our engagement with the world or intervention, typified maybe by the invasion of Iraq in 2003, that it would be our disengagement from complex problem sets that would be decisive. And
well, we pulled out of Iraq and we lived happily ever after, right?
Right. Until ISIS took control of territory the size of Britain, and we started to see these serial episodes of mass homicide associated with the Syrian civil war and the humanitarian catastrophe that that created. So, I mean, what I argue for, as you mentioned, Alan, is strategic empathy, and this is to pay particular attention to the agency and influence that others have over the future course of events, and to consider the emotions, the ideology, and the aspirations that drive and constrain others, particularly rivals, adversaries, and enemies in war.
So how do we do that? How do we get that kind of empathy?
So we have to view complex challenges from the perspective of the other, and I think what we have to do is, when we face a significant challenge, right, like the Chinese Communist Party's campaign of co-option, coercion, and concealment, or Putin's effort to drag us all down with a campaign of disruption, disinformation, and denial. Notice the alliteration, Alan. Then if you go, if you look at the problem set associated with the Greater Middle East, try to understand these conflicts on their own terms, identify the so what vital U.S. interests are at stake, view these challenges through the lens of our vital interests, and then craft realistic goals and objectives, cognizant of limitations on the degree to which we have agency and influence, and we being not just the United States, but the United States and like-minded partners. And of course, this is like-minded partners in the private sector as well, because many of these competitions that will determine, whether or not future generations of Americans have opportunities to be safe and to prosper. Many of these competitions play out in the private sector, and these are economic and informational competitions, as well as military and diplomatic.
So by empathy, you do not mean that we should understand the other and see where they're coming from and surrender to their subjective view of the world. You mean that we should understand where they're coming from, see what their true objectives are in their own terms, and then deal with it effectively from our point of view.
Yeah, absolutely, Alan. And I think that it doesn't mean sympathy, right? It doesn't mean sharing their interests and outcomes. But this is where I think negotiation and mediation theory, as it's developed in recent decades, is quite useful. And this is the old book, Getting to Yes, and then another book called Beyond Reason: Using Emotions When You Negotiate. This is the old Harvard negotiation project. There's been a similar project at Dartmouth, and now at West Point has a very strong negotiation and mediation project. And the first step in developing this kind of empathetic understanding of the other is a process called interest mapping, right? And this is I read much of this theory after time in Iraq, and realized I was applying this kind of technique in complex conflicts, and basically a sectarian civil war in microcosm in Nineveh province in Iraq. It involves listening, right? It involves listening and trying to understand the interests of the other, oftentimes reading them back to them. Hey, here's what I think your interests are. Is that right? And then understanding better where those interests are compatible with yours and where they diverge, right? And then you have an opportunity for a negotiation, right? And in war, that negotiation can involve the use of force to impose an outcome, right, consistent with what you think your vital interests. If those interests are are at stake, and you have the authorities to act militarily, and this is this is what in negotiation mediation theory is called the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. You use force and other means to make that BATNA look pretty bad, right, and to incentivize the kind of a negotiation that's essential to ending conflict and getting to sustainable political outcomes in war.
Yeah. And when it comes to, and I was struck by the strategic narcissism, because that's narcissism in sort of your particular context of geostrategy. But, couldn't you say that our whole society is increasingly narcissistic? Yeah. From our leaders on down?
Yes. And I think all you have to do is, look at news coverage these days. When is the last time? And I just mentioned this. I had a great opportunity to be in a class with some of your amazing students there at American University. And when is the last time you were watching, a news program, and they said, well, let me cut to our our foreign correspondent in, you know, wherever, right? It doesn't happen. You know, it's people sitting around a table in a newsroom talking to other people sitting around tables in newsrooms, or these days at their homes via Zoom. So, you know, I think that we really do need to become better engaged, you know, internationally. You know, it kind of broke my heart during COVID to see all the Peace Corps volunteers come back, you know, for example. You know, I think that academic exchanges, you know, with our students studying in China and Chinese students coming to the United States, and we really need to generate empathy for one another. We have a lot of work to do internally in our country, by the way, you know, to do that as well. But I really think that element of our education, right, of you know, studying the history, the cultures, the political systems of other countries is immensely important.
Yeah, and as you say, of one another in our own country, right? That
Right.
we suffer from narcissism and can use a lot more empathy for our fellow citizens.
Hey, what I worry about, Alan, is the end of empathy in our country, right? Because there are some people who make the argument, hey, you don't even get to empathize with me, right? Because of you know, your skin pigmentation or something, you know? And what we've seen lately, I think, is this crazy interaction between what you might call like identity politics on one end and racism and bigotry on the other. And what I sense is just that interaction creating centripetal forces that are pulling us apart from one another, right? We have to break that cycle and come together for civil, you know, for civil, respectful discussions of our problems and challenges. And you know, I have this belief, Alan, that if we just started our conversations with what we agree on, right, we could get a lot done. You know, even short of trying to resolve our differences in these key issues like education reform, you know, equality of opportunity, ensuring that you know that the zip code in which you are born does not determine the degree to which you're able to participate in the great potential of our free market economic system.
Yeah, well, one of the things we try to do at the Political Theory Institute here is to have these conversations, to invite people with whom we don't always agree, and sponsor debates that hopefully everyone on campus would love to hear one of the people, but the price of hearing that is that they have to listen to the other one, and hopefully come out, you know, not
Yeah.
as hateful.
No, you have such great content on the web too. I've really enjoyed going over the previous sessions, and especially those on free speech. I think are particularly poignant and important. So I really think that, you know, I make the argument in the book. Hey, we all have responsibility for this, Alan. Right? We can't wait for President Biden, right, to bring us all together. We all have to do our part. We have to convene the kind of discussions you're convening. So I see the PTI as part of the solution to this. And I really applaud you on this anniversary for what you've created.
Thank you. Okay, I want to switch up topics now. I want to talk about courage for a little while. And first, I'd just like to ask you, what made you decide to have a career in the military?
Yeah. Hey, you know, Alan, I always wanted to do it. You know, I just always wanted to do it. It's like my earliest memory, you know, and I think I was drawn toward, you know, just the attractiveness of being part of an endeavor larger than oneself, to be able to be part of a team bound together by mutual trust and common purpose and a common ethos and really what become bonds of deep affection over time as good military units take on the qualities of a family, you know, and so I was always drawn to that idea. And then even from a very young age, you know, my mother's, you know, like your mother they're both educators in the great city of Philadelphia. And you know, she I think inculcated in me intellectual curiosity and especially curiosity about history, right? And so I read a lot about military history. And so I, you know, I in what is usually opposite of the case, you know, I begged my parents to allow me to go to military school, to go to Valley Forge Military Academy, and then went on to West Point, right? So you know, I always wanted to do it. But Alan, you know, as I was at West Point, as I began to serve, you know, I really only planned to serve for 5 years, you know, and then to maybe go to law school or to, you know, do something else. And as my wife said at my retirement, as she was roasting me at the retirement party, she said, "Yes, thanks for the bonus 29 years."
Yeah.
So it's not like I mapped it out, Alan, you know. But I'll tell you, every time I received a new assignment and a new unit, I was just reinvigorated, you know, because of the new challenge the military gave me just this great gift of a really varied career. I got to lead soldiers in combat, then I got to go to graduate school, and I got to teach history and think and read and write about history. Then, I got to get involved in training and preparing for future war and conceptualizing the future army. And I mean, it was just, a broad range of really tremendously rewarding, at times very challenging experiences. But I think for those who view the military from the outside these days, they see kind of a caricature, of the military. They don't really gain an appreciation for the warrior's calling and the warrior's ethos, especially involving, self-sacrifice, and principles, like honor and like courage, and I think that it's sad, because I think that popular culture cheapens and coarsens the warrior ethos, and Hollywood tells us little, right, about what motivates our young men and women who join the armed forces. So I would just say to those who are considering service, not just in the military, but broadly, I mean, don't overlook the tremendous rewards of service and the ability to be part of a team and to be part of an endeavor bigger than yourself. And then also what's great about the military, and I know there's been some, press coverage these days about those who might harbor extremist or hyper political views being in the military. But I will tell you, from my experience, that is definitely the exception. And what you see in the military is you see people from all different backgrounds and experiences from all across the country, come in. And of course, people come with biases, right? They come with prejudices.
Would you be in favor of some kind of mandatory national service?
I don't know about mandatory. I just don't know if it's feasible, Alan. I think we should do more, on a volunteer basis and incentivize it, maybe, with scholarships or other benefits, or forgiveness of loans or something like that. I mean, I would love to see a program that incentivizes more service, broadly. Military service already has those kind of incentives associated with it. But I think that what people don't see is really how coming together like that allows you to transcend, I think, and shed maybe these biases and prejudices, and to to understand better our common humanity. Hey, you asked Alan what it's like serving overseas and what you identify about it, and what you come away with. There is oftentimes, I think, an effort, quite, I think, appropriately, to understand differences in culture, right? Differences in mores and values and so forth between societies. But what I'm struck with more than anything else from long service and places like Afghanistan and Iraq is our common humanity and what we share across our common humanity.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's a lot to work with there, right? I don't think there are too many people who want a worse life instead of a better life for their children, for example, right? Who don't care whether or not their family lives in a secure environment and their children can get an education and appropriate health care and so forth. So I really think that, sometimes we emphasize differences to a fault.
Okay, so I want to come back to courage. And Plato in the Republic talks about the two things that are most fearful and most require courage. And one is fear of death, physically dying, and the other is pursuing the truth when it's going to upset people and make them angry at you and call into question your place in the world. So I want to ask you, because you've really exemplified courage in both of those realms. And so first I just want to ask you, when you go into battle, are you scared?
Yeah. I'll tell you, Alan, I mean, everybody's experience in combat is unique, right? Because every type of battle experience in battle is different, and people bring, their own background, their own sort of, their own sort of, mental and emotional approach to combat. But Alan, I never really experienced fear in battle, and even in the midst of a very intense armored battle in the Gulf War, or
in the first Gulf War, you went into Iraq first and furthest on the ground, right?
Well, it was we were part of our cavalry troop was wound up as the vanguard of the 2nd Cavalry Regiment as we approached the Republican Guard defenses and subsequently assaulted through about 5 kilometers of Republican Guard defenses, destroying
So are
a
you feeling
a much larger
adrenaline
unit.
and no
Abs-
fear when
no.
you're going through this? What are you feeling?
Well, as a cavalry troop commander, you're feeling responsibility. And I think in combat, responsibility for others insulates you from fear, because it would be irresponsible to allow fear to cloud your thinking, to lead to hesitation, to maybe lead to bad decisions that could place your fellow soldiers at greater risk. And so I think that there are those in a combat formation who are more susceptible to fear. I think also acting against the enemy, right? Focusing on what you're doing to accomplish your mission and to defeat the enemy also can help insulate you from fear. I think, for example, in our tank assault, those who displayed the greatest courage were drivers, right? Because they're looking at this overwhelming sensory experience of fireballs and explosions, and they're driving through minefields, and they're not actively shooting or operating the weapon system against the enemy, right? And so in my case, I felt like I was insulated from fear. Now, what allows those soldiers to overcome that fear is confidence. As I mentioned, confidence is a bulwark against fear. It's confidence in their own individual abilities and their abilities to operate their equipment. My driver, my loader, Jeffrey Taylor, an awesome guy who I've just recently gotten back in contact with. We're playing phone tag right now. But he told me after the fight, he said, "Hey, sir, I ain't gonna lie, I was fixing to panic, but I said, don't panic, just do your job." Another staff sergeant, McReynolds, who was a scout squad leader in a Bradley fighting vehicle, said, "Hey, it just kind of came natural. It was like we didn't have to be told what to do because we had trained so well, right?" And was it Plato who said that if the fear is anticipated, the blow is more gentle when it comes? Who was that? Or was that Aristotle? I think it's Aristotle.
Aristotle, yeah.
I think it's Aristotle. Well, or it's one of them.
Yeah.
I think that's what that allowed us to
So let me talk about the other
Okay.
kind of courage that you displayed in your life, and that's courage in pursuing truth. And I see two big examples of this. And the first is your book on Vietnam, in which you criticize the generals for waffling and lying, right? And these were people who were in power. They were, when you were still in the military, some of them, right? Who you were criticizing your bosses. And this could have been a career killer. And many people, right, would not have gone there for fear of what it could do to them. But you nonetheless called it as you saw it, and it helped create, as I understand it, a major change in the culture of the military, right? So what were you thinking when you are writing a book, publishing a book, criticizing your bosses?
Well, I'll tell you, Alan, I mean, I didn't have the courage not to write that book, right? Because as I learned more and more about why Vietnam became an American war, hey, I was either going to write that book or I was going to be a bore at cocktail parties for the rest of my life, telling everybody else what I discovered, right? And so I had to write it. I had to get it out. I felt like I needed to tell this story to the Vietnam War veterans who fought with tremendous courage in a lost war, a war in which it was very, very difficult for those soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines to understand how the risks that they took and how the sacrifices they saw so many of their fellow veterans make was contributing to an outcome worthy of those risks and worthy of those sacrifices. I think that's the real test of strategy in war is, can you as a platoon leader explain to your soldiers how the risks that they will take, how the sacrifices they may be called on to make will contribute to that worthy outcome. And so I felt kind of driven to tell that story. And, this is another misunderstanding, I think, a little bit about the military, Alan. The military that I came up in is very forgiving in terms of wanting candid, candid feedback and candid analysis.
Everybody says they want candid feedback until you give it to them, and then they don't want it so much anymore.
Well, I should also say that by the time I wrote this book, remember, this is 97 when it came out, that the war was now, I think it was a period of time when people were ready to come to grips with it. And those who were in power, like the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Hugh Shelton, this is the book Dereliction of Duty. When he read it, he had been a major, a lieutenant colonel maybe at the time, about the time I was writing, and so he appreciated the book because it explained where a lot of his frustrations came from. And so what he did is he sent the book to every senior general and admiral in the Joint Force, and he had his executive officer, a guy named Colonel David Petraeus, call me at my Army post where I was assigned in the middle of the Mojave Desert, Fort Irwin, California. My phone rings. I'm a major in a cavalry squadron. And this is the first time I ever talked to Dave Petraeus. And he said, hey, this is Colonel Dave Petraeus calling from General Shelton's office. He just read your book. He loves it. He's sending it out to every admiral, general. And he told me to call you and to give you my phone number. And if anybody gives you a hard time about the book, to call me immediately. So that's pretty good top cover from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
You were lucky.
And yeah, I was lucky. And he's a fine person, as I think anybody who knows him knows.
Well, let me talk about the other episode of courage in your life, as I see it, with intellectual courage, right? And this was in the second Iraq War, when Rumsfeld had a strategy that wasn't working, and you were in the field and you saw it wasn't working. And as I understand it, you basically disobeyed orders and developed your own strategy. And I think you were shrewd enough to contact some major newspaper reporters who covered you, gave you good press. And through that, you were able to back channel through the military and political systems and help change the policy that brought about the surge that temporarily made things better until the surge was abandoned, right? So here's another example of you going against explicit orders, right? What were you thinking?
Well, let me just qualify that a little bit, Alan. So I didn't go against explicit orders. I went against kind of the prevailing strategy at the time, which was to accelerate the transition to an Iraqi government that didn't carry the legitimacy with it because it had become a party to a growing sectarian civil war. A civil war that was playing out in Western Nineveh province, and a civil war that demanded first the breaking of a cycle of sectarian violence by defeating a jihadist terrorist organization alongside courageous Iraqi troops, but to fight alongside them and to secure the population to break that cycle of violence as the first step in bringing enduring security and stability. So we put in a much different approach. We pursued a much different approach. And it was in contravention to what I think some of the expectations of some of my superior officers were. I didn't contact any press. I didn't ask for any press. They arrived and wrote about it. My philosophy was when reporters came and, whether it was George Packer who wrote a piece on this in the New Yorker, I always talked to them last, right? Because I didn't want to be there as a regimental commander and say, hey, let me tell you what you're going to find out. I just sent the reporters out to go to the platoons and the cavalry troops and the tank companies, artillery batteries, and to talk to our soldiers and talk to Iraqis and talk to the local mayor and the local police chief and the sheikhs and the mukhtars, and then come talk to me at the end, because I wanted them to really see that what I was going to describe to them, I wasn't, giving them a briefing, that was detached from the reality on the ground. So I think what this showed is it showed that we were on a rush to failure in Iraq, and that if we applied a different range of approaches, that we could achieve maybe enduring security and stability there. I believe that manifested itself in the surge later, but that was an approach that was abandoned prematurely because the victories gained, in the surge, which was much more than just a reinforcement of troops. It was a whole different, conception of how to fight the war. They weren't consolidated, and those gains they were always, we knew, fragile and reversible. And so it was heartbreaking to see the cycle of violence return later, and then the rise of ISIS. And these are people who had suffered so much, and so, but I'll tell you, when the stakes are high like that, Alan, I mean, I think you owe it to your soldiers, you owe it to your country, to give candid assessments. And you don't have to be disrespectful, I mean, the conversations that I've had with leaders over the years, I would always try to begin with, hey, here's the objective I think we're trying to accomplish. Is that right? Yeah. And you have to get agreement on what the objective is. And then you can say, well, what we're doing now may not be the best way to get to that objective because of these reasons. What if we took a different approach? And I think if you do that respectfully, it's going to be there are going to be very few people who are vindictive about it. Now, in my case, I bumped heads a little bit, and I mean, this is a reason why, that I wasn't, promoted to Brigadier General for a while, I think maybe, but nobody's entitled to promotion to Brigadier General anyway. Every day is a privilege to serve. I was at peace with that, and so, I would have changed a thing that we did as a regiment there. I'm really proud of what our troopers accomplished alongside, as I mentioned, courageous Iraqis. And, there, I think,
all you students out there, I hope you listen to that carefully about both the physical and intellectual courage there, and that's something to emulate. And in many ways, HR, you're a real hero, and I especially wanted to talk about courage because it's so lacking in our polity now, right? And in among citizens, right, where there's where racism is the worst. A lot of people just are silent and let it slide. Where political correctness is rampant, a lot of people who don't agree with it are just silent and let it slide. Our politicians, Congress is feckless, and rather than take a vote that will piss off some of their constituents, they give power over to the executive, and the checks and balances are all out of power. And I mean, our country is really lacking courage. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think in certain instances, yes, for sure. And I'm no hero, Alan, but I did get to serve with some heroes. And, I'll tell you, the most difficult part of combat, I don't want anybody to think I'm romanticizing battle, because, the hardest thing is to see those, in your command, especially, and, your fellow soldiers who, as I mentioned, become like a member of your family, killed, make the ultimate sacrifice in battle. And what I've tried to do, within the commands in the midst of those fights, is to honor them with our deeds as we accomplish the mission, to achieve an outcome that's worthy of the sacrifice that they made. And I think you can say that broadly about those who fought to defend our nation and our freedoms, across many generations, right? We are, as Americans, we are a living historical experience in society, right? And I think it's up to us, it's up to us to preserve the legacy that was bequeathed to us, but to build on it and improve on it, and I think it is important for us to expect more of leaders, expect, our leaders to behave with courage, and not to compromise their principles, in this case, to maybe score partisan political points or for self-advancement, right? And it goes back to base motivation. Like, what are you in it, whatever it is, in terms of your profession? What are you in it for, right? And are you in it to make a difference in real people's lives? Are you in it to accomplish missions and a good, greater than yourself? If that's the case, I think these decisions on whether to speak out or not speak out, they become actually very, very easy, right? I mean, I knew, for example, as National Security Advisor in the Trump administration, you're going to get used up. Right? And if you're at peace with that and do the best job you can, for the president and the country, because you're not there to pursue your own agenda, right? You're there to serve under the Constitution and to serve the elected president. Then those choices become pretty easy.
Okay, so I want to remind people to send in questions. We do have a lot of questions, but I want to ask you two more before I turn it over to the questions. And the first one is has to do with, I described this talk as, what is the national interest, right? So we've talked a lot about courage, and you've talked in particular about sacrifice. When should we be willing to sacrifice lives and treasure? How do you define the national interest? How do you think that through?
Well, I think you have to think first in terms of security, right? And we've seen when our security has been placed at risk, and when we've suffered, when we've suffered, on the receiving end of violence from enemies, and September 11th, I think, is an example of that. I think we have other vital interests that we need to advance, but not through, through military means, right? And this is to ensure that, that we build a future that is prosperous for not only America, but, for citizens across the world. And we do so by promoting, free, fair, and reciprocal trade and economic relationships. I think that we ought to advance our influence in the world, because I do believe that, that America and what we stand for, the idea that people should have a say in how they're governed, they should live under rule of law, they should enjoy, religious and tolerance and equal opportunity, regardless of race or religion or sexual orientation. The belief in freedom of expression and freedom of speech. And so anyway, I think that our advancing our interests, our influence is important as well. But really, I think we have to think in terms of a war decision, right? To think in terms of security, and to ensure, first of all, that we have the ability to deter conflict, right? To preserve peace. That's what our military should primarily be for. But to preserve peace, you have to be able to demonstrate to those who might become your enemies, that they can't accomplish their objectives through the use of force, right? And so the good old fashioned Thomas Schelling deterrence by denial, right, is something that I think we have to focus on. And then, of course, we magnify our security when we enter into alliances and partnerships with like-minded partners who share our principles, and so I think maintaining strong alliance structures these days is very important as well. And then we have to operate against threats to us that are below the threshold of what might elicit a military response. We see this with the ongoing cyber offensives against us, and then for example, Russia's sustained campaign of cyber-enabled information warfare, for example. So I described the range of these threats in the book. I try to view them through the lens of our vital interests, and recommend actions that are reasoned, and sustainable over time.
Yeah. And my last question has to do with the civilian side of defense and being a strong, prosperous, secure nation. Because I was quite pleased to see that the conclusion of your book talks a lot about the civilian side of things, right? And most of the book is sort of military political strategy. But at the end, you talk about how so much of this depends on education. And as a lifelong educator, I was pleased to hear that. But so can you tell us, what kind of education do you think our students ought to be getting at universities, at a place like American University? Students, listen.
Well, it all begins with political theory, Alan.
Yes, of course.
But hey, I think undergraduates should be careful not to specialize too quickly. I think that you should look for a broad-based, more generalized education that allows you to understand your interests, and then to be able to delve more deeply into your interests. I think we ought to come out of secondary education, and certainly out of the academy, with a sense of who we are, and how the past produced the present, so we can make an informed
Who we are as Americans.
And as humans, as well,
right,
the experience of across humanity. I think that
right.
Whenever undergraduates are faced with a choice between taking a course that is very narrowly circumscribed on a narrow topic and a broader topic, go for the broader topic, right? Because you can go to graduate school and write a thesis on whatever the heck you want to, right? But I think take advantage of the opportunity to study, the human experience in the way that Sir Michael Howard, I think, recommended studying military history. I think this applies. It's in a great essay that he wrote called "The Use and Abuse of Military History," and in it he says that we ought to study history in width, depth, and in context. Right? In width, so you're able to see changes over time, and I think I read about this in the conclusion of Battlegrounds or in the introduction, and then in depth, so you can understand the complex causality of events, right? And the human dimension of events, and how the tidy outlines of certain theories kind of dissolve, right? When you look at the emotional and psychological experience, of whatever you're studying. social experience of what you're studying. And then in context, right? Study war in context of our democratic political system and the need to maintain sufficient will to prosecute that war, for example. And so I think width, depth, and context is a good approach to undergraduate education. And I think interdisciplinary is the other, right? To recognize that, to understand complex problems, you have to view them from an interdisciplinary perspective. And I think that what that means is nobody's an expert, I don't think, on anything, Alan, right? I mean, like, I think, when you're dealing with complex problems, you have to convene people. You have to work collaboratively to frame complex problems and challenges and apply design kind of thinking. You need a scientific perspective and an economic perspective. And so I really am an advocate, for a broad-based undergraduate education in a classical sense. And don't miss, I would just tell undergrads, don't miss that opportunity, and if you're worried about, hey, I really, really want to go to, med school, or whatever, do a 5th year maybe and study biochemistry only and get ready or something. You have opportunities to do that, I think. Um, and and then I would say, between undergraduate and graduate school, if you're able to do so, this might be the perfect time for a service opportunity to gain sort of a life experience that will help you understand better what you want to do long term, and then to prepare via graduate school maybe for that opportunity. But I think oftentimes young people, when I talk to them, especially, at university level, or these are juniors and especially seniors, who are about to leave university, they want to know, like, how do I map out my life, like, from this moment, right? And I would just say, don't put that pressure on yourself. Do something that's challenging and fun, and you think is going to be worthwhile, and just do it. And then that path will take you in, that initial job or the opportunity you take advantage of will take you in directions you probably you were unable to anticipate, before you graduated.
Yeah, well, that's great. That's I echo all of that. I personally, the Political Theory Institute stands for broad liberal arts education, interdisciplinary, knowing our history, all in favor of knowing the warts, not pretending otherwise, but seeing it in context alongside with the good and great aspects of America as well. Okay, let's turn it over to student questions now. So let me see what we have here. So here's a question from a recent SPA, a recent graduate. What do you suggest needs to be done in order to effectively deter our adversaries from interfering in U.S. domestic affairs, i.e. elections, government, company, cyber attacks? Short
Yeah.
follow-up: has cyberspace become another dimension of warfare?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Cyberspace has become another dimension of warfare, and it's become a dimension of warfare and competition short of war. And I think about 4 fundamental areas. First is what you think in terms of attacks on infrastructure, right? Offensive cyber capabilities that can attack our financial infrastructure, like Iran did in 2007. Go after, a dam in New York, like the Russians did, a few years ago, as I think, kind of a warning to us. The threats to power grids and other transportation infrastructure and so forth. And there are military applications of this offensive cyber capability as well, right? To disrupt assured communications and precision navigation and timing and access to space and so forth. So that's one realm. The second is cyber-enabled in espionage, and that we saw with the big Russia hack. You see that with APT-10, Advanced Precision Threat 10, that the Chinese use as the main organization for industrial espionage against the United States. A third area is criminality, and this is what North Korea is particularly good at with ransomware. It's a big fund source of funds, for them. So you have state and non-state actors based in cyber crime and criminality and theft, financial theft. And then finally, you have cyber-enabled information warfare, which you're talking about with Russia. So for cyber-enabled information warfare, I think that we have to have a good offense to also have a good defense, and some of the changes in policy in recent years, that some of which has been written about, have allowed, I think, our cyber defenders to combine offense and defense much more effectively. There was a dramatic difference in the IRA, the Internet Research Agency's ability to disrupt our 2016 elections and the 2018 elections. We've done a much better job at not just offensive, but also defending and hardening systems. I think our election system is quite hardened, right? And I think it's really difficult and not impossible, right, for a state actor to change the results of a U.S., especially national election, mainly because of the decentralized nature of the 54 different systems there, but also some of the countermeasures that have been put in place in recent years, especially ensuring a paper backup to verify election results and a bunch of other means. Should we do more to make our elections even more secure? Yes, no doubt about it. But the physical security is important. But what Russia wants to do is they do not really want to determine the outcome of elections in the United States. What they want to do is ensure that a vast majority, not a vast majority, a vast number, just a vast number of Americans, a significant number of Americans doubt the legitimacy of the result. And this is where I think we have a lot more work to do ourselves to inoculate ourselves against Russia's campaign of disinformation and denial, and to not play into Russia's hands, by trying to score political points in a way that compromises our confidence in our democratic processes. I think you could say that this was a failure of the Democratic Party in 2016 when certain members of the Democratic Party said, "Hey, Russia rigged the election, right? Trump's illegitimate." I mean, there was no evidence for that, but that, of course, claim did exactly what Vladimir Putin wanted. And of course, the most extreme example of aiding and abetting the Russians is President Trump himself, right? And this is especially in his behavior even before the election, but then especially after the election. And so I think what all of us can do is educate ourselves better, so we're less susceptible to these kind of crazy conspiracy theories, especially those associated with widespread corruption during the election, for example. But then also that we are able to demand better from our political leaders, that they not compromise, our principles and our confidence in our democratic process to score partisan political points. So I think there's a lot we can do internally. And again, this gets to the point, Alan, that I made in the conclusion about education being the most important, right? Those who are least knowledgeable about these issues are those who are most susceptible to demagoguery, right? And to these conspiracy theories and disinformation that operate, at times even in the mainstream media, but certainly in the pseudo media and in social media. And then, hey, turnabout's fair play, right? I mean, hey, Putin, hey, the old tour of his mansion there on the Black Sea didn't make him too happy, and so I think the advantage that we have, all we have to do is use the truth, right? I mean, what the Russians are doing is expropriating, sites and fueling kind of this interaction, between, on issues of race primarily is what they try to divide us on, followed by other hot button topics like immigration and gun control. So, we can inoculate ourselves by having civil discussions of these issues, by coming together, strengthening our common identity as Americans, and being better informed on the issues as well.
Okay, here's a question from Ben Mermel, an AU sophomore. To what degree do you find that morality and the national interest align? And if they do we have a moral obligation to intervene forcefully when only humanitarian interests are at stake? Virtually no country on the planet in history has pursued a policy of truly altruistic intervention, and the U.S. is no different. Should that policy change?
Yeah. Well, we're in a democracy, right? And you'll get, the foreign policy that the American people will support. So I think if an American leader wants to align, our morality with our actions, especially military actions, that president has to make the case to the American people. President Clinton didn't do that in the Rwanda genocide, right? He later visited Rwanda later in his presidency and apologized for that. I think we can learn from that, right? I think we could learn from Srebrenica and the experience there. I believe that we do have a moral obligation, we being, right, humanity broadly. But when it comes to the use of force, I think we have to recognize that the American people in our democracy have to support it, right? And we can't solve all of the world's ills, but heck, we know, because we do it, we have done a lot of good, not only in connection with military intervention, but look at America's, health security programs, over the years, the PEPFAR program and the impact that had on the African continent in particular. So, I think that, we often see the shortcomings, the difficulties, the failures. But what we also have to do is look at the successes, right? And explain those to the American people. Because I think there's a great deal of skepticism these days about sustained engagement abroad. And certainly with, with aid and development programs, as well as with any kind of military intervention. And I think in recent administrations, I think especially in the later part of the Trump administration and the Obama administration, there has been a tendency to view popular will to support these kind of efforts as fixed. Well, no, actually, a leader can lead, right? And lead public opinion in a direction if they can make a compelling case to the American people.
Yeah. Okay. We have a student from a question from a freshman, Elena Chichester, and she asks, what international issues are not getting enough focus on them today?
Yeah. Well, I would say the one that is really just kind of dropped off, kind of almost inexplicably, is jihadist terrorism and the threat that poses to our country, right? And we talk about black swans, right? But as one of my friends, Frank Hoffman, says, hey, this one is a pink flamingo, right? I mean, it's right there. You shouldn't miss it, right? And why are jihadist terrorist organizations more dangerous today, I would argue, than they were on September 10th, 2001? They're more dangerous because they're orders of magnitude larger. It was the Afghan alumni who executed the most devastating terrorist attack in history against us, and now we have an Al Qaeda alumni, a Nusra alumni, an ISIS alumni that is orders of magnitude larger. By the way, this alumni are now mixed into many different countries. Some in Europe, countries from which we don't require visas coming to the United States. Magnifying the threat even further is the danger associated with these groups pursuing the most destructive weapons on earth. I recommend Audrey Cronin's book on this point called Power to the People. And she's there at AU, and man, are you lucky to have her. She's tremendous. And her book on how terrorism ends, also the best two books on terrorism, I would say, to read.
Okay.
And she's just an awesome person and a great scholar and everything. So I think that's another reason. Another reason is how connected, right, these terrorist organizations are, right? Their ability to use encrypted communications on their cell phones, to develop slick recruiting videos, and to operate in this crazy information space that we have, involving social media and the potential of social media to radicalize people and so forth. So I think we're taking the ball off it. And what really makes it more dangerous is our regarding disengagement from this fight as an unmitigated good. The withdrawal of our very few soldiers, a few hundred soldiers from Somalia, it makes no sense to me. I mean, because Al-Shabaab is a very dangerous organization that wants to kill our children. I mean, this is a group with a very significant, what they call external threat, external operations desire. The efforts, even in the G5 Sahel, mainly being borne by France but enabled by us, I think it's worth sustaining. Think of this as an insurance policy. And then in Afghanistan, I think it's abhorrent what we're doing in connection with the deal with the Taliban, setting the Afghan government up for failure within these Taliban negotiations. I would just ask everybody, what do you think power sharing with the Taliban looks like? What does that look like? I mean, is that mass executions every other Saturday? Is that every other girls' school bulldozed? Right? I mean, I think that we've conjured the enemy we would prefer, rather than the actual enemy that the Taliban is, and the Taliban is interconnected with these other groups that exist in this terrorist ecosystem across the Afghanistan and Pakistan border, where we already have over 20 U.S. designated 20 terrorist organizations operating. And these organizations are not monolithic or homogeneous, right? They share people, they share resources, they share knowledge. They have access to a very lucrative drug trade that finances their efforts. So, hey, disengaging from that, okay, I get the idea of war weariness and end the endless wars. But, wars don't end when one side leaves, right? I mean, that's an extreme version of strategic narcissism.
Yeah. And so what would your recommendation be for Afghanistan now?
Okay, so what if we already won the war in Afghanistan and we just didn't tell ourselves that? And so what does winning look at Afghanistan? Well, Afghanistan is it was an ugly presidential election, but it's an elected government. Afghanistan is a violent place, but hey, it probably will be a violent place for some time. It's not going to be Denmark, right? Afghanistan doesn't need to be Denmark. It just needs to be Afghanistan. And what really has to happen for a sustainable and satisfactory outcome, not ideal outcome, in Afghanistan are really four fundamental things, right? One is to focus on a political settlement internal to the country in which all of Afghan's various groups can work together toward a common vision and reduce this competition for
But is
power and
that
survival.
possible? I mean, everybody wants
Yeah.
that.
No,
How
it is
can that
possible.
happen?
It is possible, Alan. I mean, there is a really growing, young, multi-ethnic reform movement in Afghanistan. I mean, these are people that are voiceless to us because nobody ever goes to Afghanistan and talks to them. And I mean, we don't even know these people exist. They exist there. And the reason why internally Afghanistan is so fragmented is because one of the reasons is we keep saying we're leaving. So they look over their backs, hey, who's got our back? Nobody. Hey, well, what we better do is get ready for a return of the Civil War from 92 to 96. So our group better be in a position of relative advantage, right? Vis-a-vis other groups. And so we have to build up our foundation of power. And they do that through illicit activity. They do that through activities that weaken state institutions and functions, which relates to the second task is to harden Afghanistan against the regenerative capacity of the Taliban. Afghans are bearing the brunt of this fight, as I mentioned, right? I mean, 10 to 30 Afghan soldiers and policemen are giving their lives every day to preserve the freedoms that they've enjoyed since the end of Taliban rule at the end of 2001. And then, of course, we have to address Pakistan and the Pakistan Army's intelligence arm, the inter-service intelligence support for these groups that perpetuate conflict in Pakistan, and then finally maintain international support. The United States doesn't have to bear the cost of this. In fact, before the latest withdrawal that President Trump announced, there were more coalition forces outside of the Afghans in Afghanistan than there were U.S. troops, right? And the Afghan forces, as I mentioned, were bearing the brunt of the fight, right? So I think it was sustainable, Alan. I think we talked ourselves into defeat in Afghanistan, and we made too many compromises with the Taliban. On the way out, I mean, we got the Afghan government to release 5,000 of some of the most heinous people on earth, and then we didn't insist on a ceasefire. What did the Taliban do? They intensified attacks. They attacked a maternity hospital and gunned down infants and expectant mothers. They attacked the American University of Afghanistan and killed young people who were there studying as undergraduates to try to build a better future for them and their children. I mean, it's abhorrent, the violence that's been visited on the Afghan people, during this so-called negotiation process. And so the Taliban are sitting across the conference table, from Afghans in Doha, Qatar. They're saying, what are we even talking to you for? We defeated the world's greatest superpower, so I don't think we could have pursued a more destructive, damaging, immoral strategy than we have in Afghanistan.
That's pretty damning. Okay, we've got a question from Matthew Levengood, an AU senior and Army ROTC, who enjoyed working with you as an intern at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy. And he asks, given the rapid politicization of the military under the previous administration, I wonder if you agree with that statement, what steps should senior civilian and military leaders take to reaffirm civil military norms?
Yeah. Okay. I think that bold line that I talked about, between the military and partisan politics, it's still in place, right? And I think what we saw evidence in both parties of leaders who tried to drag the military into partisan politics, right? So from the military, what we have to do is say, keep that bold line in place, right? I think General Milley, the chairman, if you look at the letter that he issued after the Lafayette Square incident, and then the speech that he gave at National Defense University, really talking to the force. I think he sent a very strong, clear, unambiguous message about expectations associated with keeping that bold line in place. And then I think that there besides Lafayette Square and besides President Trump's rhetoric that drew into question the actions of the military, the same has happened kind of at times on the Democratic side. Then presidential candidate Biden, when he said, well, the Joint Chiefs of Staff will march out, Trump on Inauguration Day. Hey, that's, you don't want to say that, right? Because our founders, they really did a good job with this, right? Because they built our Constitution for the worst case scenarios. And for them, the worst case scenarios were the bloody wars in England in the 17th century. And so they had in mind an Oliver Cromwell figure. So they made it clear in our Constitution, the executive branch has no role in the transition of power. Right now, President Trump tried to have one, but he doesn't get one. Right, and the military has no participation. And again, General Milley put out a statement I think that was strong in that connection. But when Speaker Pelosi, and I mean, maybe it's understandable after the assault on the Capitol, but when she calls the chairman and says, "Hey, he's not going to do anything crazy with nuclear weapons or something," and then makes that public, right? That's dragging the military into partisan politics, right? And we just have to say to our political leaders, if you do that at great risk. And then to our military, professionals, we have to be really tough on it. I remember giving, I think it was a summarized Article 15 to a warrant officer in the 90s for him sending out disparaging emails about President Clinton, right? I mean, there has to be a zero tolerance for this, right? Regardless of who's president at the time. And we have to guard, our own professionalism and our ethos. And I think there's a danger. I respect obviously my former colleagues, my fellow washed up generals and admirals, to add their names to various lists of those who endorse one candidate or other. But I think that too comes with a price, even in retirement. So I've tried to, and it was super hard to do. I don't know if I've done it successfully. I think you face a choice, right? Either you try to transcend it, like Margaret Fuller would have us do, right? transcend the vitriolic partisanship, or you can get drugged down into it, and I think, I'm trying to transcend it while it's still calling out behavior that all of us can say is unacceptable, such as, the president's behavior that since the end of the election that culminated, contributed to at least the assault on the Capitol.
Okay. Question from my colleague, Tom Merrill. What should undergraduates at AU be reading or studying to think adequately about foreign affairs? Would you recommend any books for us to read in our classes?
Yeah. Well, luckily, there's a recommended reading list in the back of Battlegrounds. So rather than go through all of those, I mentioned one of them already, Power to the People on Terrorism. I think it's really important to understand how the recent past produced the present. This is why it's not on my recommended reading list, but I still like The Looming Tower in terms of understanding how Al-Qaeda and the jihadist terrorist threat grew in the 1990s. I think on China, man, you can't beat John Pomfret's book, the Beautiful Country and the Middle Kingdom. It's a lengthy book, but it's a story extremely well told about America's relationship with China going back to the 17th century or 17th century. And then I think on Russia, there's a new book out, and gosh, I'm spacing out the author's name right now. It's called Putin's People, which is exceptionally well done. And then gosh, I mean, I could go on in these specific topics, but for a long time. But I think it's important to read broadly, and then as you're reading and as you're studying history in width, depth, and context, maybe develop a little bit of your own theory of strategic competence. What are the essential elements of it? How should we think about complex problems? How should we think about America's role in the world? How do we think about how we overcome challenges and take advantage of opportunities to build a better future, not only for America but for humanity? And I think if you can engage books actively, with your questions in mind, you will get so much more out of them. And I think also if you start reading a book, and it's boring, man, bag it, go to a different book, and
except for the ones I assign, but they're not boring.
And of course, Battlegrounds is a page turner, I assure you. No, but if you also, for books that are well organized, you can also kind of break a book, right? If you want to get something out of it, you can read the introduction and the conclusion. You can then read the first paragraph and last paragraph of each chapter. Then you kind of go through skimming the chapter, look at the topic sentences, concluding sentences. If it's a well-crafted book, you can get through it pretty quickly, and then you can read the parts in depth you really want to go into depth. I remember one of my great professors, Don Higginbotham at University of North Carolina. What a great historian of the American Revolution, and a guy with a great sense of humor, I mean, he told me, when I finished my written exams, he said, "Hey, congratulations, HR. You now know more history than you will ever know."
Yeah.
And one time I asked him, I said, hey, have you read this book? I think it was Gordon Wood's, book on radicalization, the American Revolution. And he looked at me like over his glasses and he said, HR, historians do not read books, they use them. And so I think,
Ouch, I don't like that.
well, you're a philosopher, of course you won't like it. But I think engaging with a book, and reading it purposefully, I think is important.
All right. That should have been our last question, but I'm going to ask one more.
Hey, and on Instagram, there's a picture because my daughter drugged me into social media. There's a picture on my Instagram that is of the books that I just finished, a stack of books I just finished in quarantine. Among them, by the way, Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law, which I highly recommend, which really shows how de jure inequality of opportunity and segregation was put into place during the Great Migration and then after World War II, and how the civil rights movement began to reverse that, but also what more work has to be done. It's a depressing story. It's interesting. It begins in the Bay Area, and I live very close, to East Palo Alto, and so that was a great book. And then also I enjoyed Cold War Civil Rights, which also is not a particularly happy story, but basically it makes the connection between having to be better ourselves to compete with Soviet communism, right? And then therefore being more introspective and doing better in connection with civil rights and equality of opportunity. So this is a glimmer of hope for us as well, right? As we compete with the Chinese Communist Party, with Russia's authoritarian model, maybe we can use that to motivate us, right? To make the improvements we need to make in our own society.
All right, I'm just going to ask a last question now, and this is what didn't I ask you that I should have asked you? What do you want to tell us?
Oh, hey,
What else do we need to know?
Yeah, I'll tell you, it was so fun to be with you, Alan. I mean, I just think that I guess we should all I'll just ask everybody to ask yourselves, right? What more can you do? What more can you do to generate empathy and understanding, right, among your contemporaries? Bring people together for meaningful, thoughtful discussions. It's tough in a pandemic to do it, right? But hey, we can do this, and I really think that this is a time for optimism, because we have, I hope, hit bottom with these quadruple traumas, I think we can take solace from our historical record, one that is far from unblemished, that is far from without significant disappointments, but one that clearly demonstrates that we do have this gift of our constitutional form of government and our democratic form of government, and we do have tremendous capacity for self-improvement. So, I'll tell you, whenever I interact, and I'm sorry I can't see everybody on the screen and everything, whenever I interact with students, here or American University, here on the West Coast, it just bolsters my confidence, and I think that our younger generation is unfortunately caricatured oftentimes. I think they possess a tremendous desire to serve, and are tremendously talented people who we haven't even begun to realize their full potential, as a generation. So hey, I'm optimistic. I guess that's the best note I could end on, Alan.
Well, that's great. Thank you. American University students, I just want to let you know that you have an opportunity to attend a class with Professor McMaster. Professor, I'm elevating you. I'm giving you a promotion. Through the Sine Institute on strategy and leadership. And I think, as you can see, he's quite a leader, quite a strategist. And I want to give you the moniker, the thinking general. So HR, thank you so much for being with us today, and thank everybody for joining.
Thanks, Alan. What a pleasure to see you, be with you, and my best to all of you at American University. Thank you so much.
Thanks for being with us.